In the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, a needle pricked more than fabric. It pierced the veil of secrets, unleashing a shadow that turned tea-time whispers into screams of terror. Welcome to Miss Marple and the Shadow over the Sewing Circle, a tale of intrigue where every stitch hides a sinister thread. Grab a cup of tea, settle into your favorite chair, and let the mystery unfold. If you're hooked on the suspense, hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us as we unravel this enigma together. Chapter 1. The Gathering Storm Miss. Jane Marple adjusted her spectacles, peering out from her cosy cottage window at the misty English countryside, where the autumn leaves danced like forgotten clues in the wind. In St. Mary Mead, life moved at a gentle pace, but today felt different. A subtle chill hung in the air, as if the village itself held its breath. Our story begins with the weekly meeting of the Sewing Circle, a group of local women who gathered every Tuesday afternoon at the vicarage to mend garments, share gossip and sip Earl Grey. Little did they know, this ordinary ritual was about to become the stage for a puzzle that would test even Miss Marple's keen eye for human nature. At the heart of the circle was Mrs. Eleanor Price, the stern organizer, with a reputation for impeccable hems and even sharper judgments. She ruled the group with an iron thimble, ensuring every stitch was precise and every conversation stayed light. Joining her were the usual suspects: young Lucy Hale, fresh from London with her modern ideas and a penchant for bold patterns; widow Agnes Blackwood, whose tales of her late husband's adventures always bordered on the dramatic; and timid Miss Clara Finch, who knitted more scarves than anyone could wear, her fingers trembling slightly as if sensing unseen dangers. The vicarage parlour was warm, filled with the soft clink of teacups and the rustle of fabric, but an undercurrent of tension simmered beneath the surface. Rumours had spread like wildfire through the village, whispers of a missing heirloom brooch from the Price family estate, a priceless sapphire piece said to carry a curse. Mrs. Price dismissed it as nonsense, but her eyes darted nervously to the shadows in the room. As the women settled in, threading needles and unfolding quilts, Miss Marple arrived fashionably late, her knitting bag slung over her arm like a detective's toolkit. She smiled serenely, but her mind was already at work, observing the small tells. Lucy's fidgety hands, Agnes's forced laughter, Clara's averted gaze. "What a lovely gathering," Miss Marple said softly, taking her seat. The conversation turned to village news, the new postman who seemed too curious, the strange lights seen near the old mill at night. But it was Mrs. Price's announcement that shifted the mood. "Ladies, I've invited a guest today," she declared, her voice steady but her knuckles white on her teacup. "Mr. Reginald Thorne, the antique dealer from town, to appraise some of our older pieces." Thorne entered moments later, a slick man with a waxed moustache and eyes that gleamed like polished silver. He greeted them with charm, but Miss Marple noted his lingering glance at Mrs. Price's sewing basket, where something metallic glinted briefly. The appraisal began innocently enough. Thorne examined Agnes's embroidered handkerchief, praising its Victorian flair, and Lucy's modern quilt, suggesting it could fetch a pretty penny at auction. But when he reached for Clara's half-finished scarf, she pulled it back sharply. "Not this one," she murmured, her face paling. The room fell quiet, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Thorne chuckled it off, moving on to Mrs. Price's prized possession, an antique sewing box passed down through generations. As he opened it, a gasp escaped the group. The sapphire brooch was there, nestled among threads, but tarnished and scratched as if recently disturbed. "How peculiar," Thorne said, his smile fading. "This looks like it's been tampered with." Mrs. Price's hand flew to her throat. "Impossible! It's been locked away." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes sharp. She recalled a similar case from her youth, where a seemingly innocent hobby group hid motives of jealousy and theft. Here, the clues were emerging. The brooch's sudden appearance, the guest's timely invitation, the women's uneasy glances. Was it a simple mix-up or the start of something darker? As the meeting wrapped up amid awkward farewells, a shadow seemed to lengthen across the vicarage floor. Literal or figurative, Miss Marple couldn't yet say. But she knew one thing. In St. Mary Mead, secrets rarely stayed buried for long. With the circle dispersed and the first hints of mystery planted, the stage is set for deeper revelations. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Lane. The cobblestone path from the vicarage to Miss Marple's cottage wound through St. Mary Mead like a ribbon, lined with hedgerows that seemed to lean in, eager to overhear secrets. It was late afternoon, and the village glowed under a fading sun, but the air carried a restless edge, as if the day's events had stirred something unseen. Miss Marple walked slowly, her knitting bag swinging gently, her mind weaving through the morning's peculiarities, the tarnished brooch, Mr. Thorne's calculating gaze, and Clara's sudden flinch. They were threads in a tapestry she couldn't yet see. Her destination wasn't home but the village shop, where gossip flowed as freely as tea, and answers often hid in plain sight. Inside the shop, the bell above the door jingled, announcing her arrival to a room smelling of fresh bread and lavender polish. Mrs. Daisy Miller, the shopkeeper, stood behind the counter, her apron dusted with flour and her eyes bright with curiosity. "Miss Marple, you're late today," she said, wiping her hands. "Heard about the sewing circle? Something's amiss, isn't it?" Miss Marple smiled, selecting a tin of biscuits with deliberate care. Daisy was a fountain of village talk, and with the right nudge, she'd spill more than flour. "Oh, just a lively meeting," Miss Marple replied, her tone light. Mr. Thorne's visit caused quite a stir. Daisy leaned closer, lowering her voice. "That man's been poking around, you know. Seen him near the old mill, asking about the Price family's history. Odd, for an antique dealer." Miss Marple's fingers paused on the tin. The old mill, abandoned since the war, was a place of ghost stories and rumours. Lately, those strange lights at night. She filed the detail away, turning the conversation to Clara Finch. "Poor Clara seemed out of sorts today," she said casually. Daisy's eyes widened. "Clara, she's been jumpy for weeks. Came in here last month, buying candles and muttering about keeping things safe." Wouldn't say more, but she looked scared, Miss Marple, like she'd seen a shadow move. The shopkeeper's words hung heavy, and Miss Marple felt a familiar prickle, the sense that a small detail was about to unravel a larger truth. Leaving the shop, Miss Marple took the long route home, passing the lane by the mill. The structure loomed, its weathered boards creaking in the wind, windows like empty eyes. She noticed fresh footprints in the mud, men's boots, deep and deliberate, leading toward the mill's rusted door. They weren't old, perhaps from last night. Her thoughts drifted to Reginald Thorne, his polished shoes and sharp demeanour. Why would an antique dealer linger in such a forsaken place? And why was Clara, of all people, buying candles in bulk? Miss Marple recalled a case from years ago where a nervous villager's odd purchases, lamp oil in that instance, had pointed to hidden meetings. Was Clara hiding something or protecting it? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit a fire and settled into her armchair, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. The village was a puzzle, each person a piece, and today's clues were mounting. The footprints suggested someone was using the mill, perhaps for more than nostalgia. Daisy's gossip hinted at Clara's fear, and Thorne's interest in the Price family felt too pointed to be innocent. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she looped a stitch. The sewing circle wasn't just mending clothes. It was stitching over secrets, and one of them was fraying fast. As the fire crackled, casting long shadows across the room, Miss Marple sensed the mystery deepening, pulling her toward the heart of St. Mary Mead's unrest. Chapter 3. The Mill's Secret, The morning sun filtered through the mist that clung to St. Mary Mead, painting the village in soft golds and greys. But the old mill stood apart, its silhouette stark against the dawn. Miss Marple, never one for idleness, decided to investigate the footprints she'd spotted the previous evening. Armed with her umbrella, more for poking into corners than shielding from rain, she set out toward the mill, her steps measured but purposeful. The village was waking slowly. A milk cart rattled by, and sparrows chattered in the hedgerows, oblivious to the unease that had settled in her mind. The mill, with its sagging roof and boarded windows, was no longer just a relic of the past. It was a question mark, and Miss Marple intended to find answers. As she approached, the air grew damp, carrying the faint scent of moss and rotting wood. The footprints she'd seen yesterday were still there, now joined by a second set, smaller and less distinct, as if someone had tried to tread lightly. She crouched, her knees creaking slightly, and examined the tracks. The larger prints, likely a man's, led straight to the mill's door, while the smaller ones veered off toward a cluster of overgrown brambles nearby. Miss Marple's eyes followed the trail, noting a faint disturbance in the foliage, a snapped twig, a flattened patch of grass. Someone had been here, and recently. She pushed through the brambles, her umbrella parting the thorns, and found a small clearing. There, half hidden by leaves, was a canvas sack, its contents spilling slightly. A coil of thread, a pair of sewing scissors, and a single candle stub. Its wax dripped in a hurried pattern. Her mind raced. The candle stub linked to Daisy's tale of Clara Finch's purchases, but the sewing items pointed to the circle itself. Was Clara sneaking out here, or someone else from the group? Miss Marple tucked the sack under her arm, careful not to disturb its contents further, and turned her attention to the mill's door. It was ajar, the rusted padlock dangling uselessly. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and beams of light pierced through cracks, illuminating cobwebs and broken machinery. She stepped carefully, her umbrella tapping the floorboards, which groaned under her weight. In a corner, she spotted a pile of crates, some pried open, revealing glints of metal, old tools perhaps, or something more valuable. A faint scratch mark on the floor suggested one crate had been dragged recently, and beside it lay a single sapphire bead, its deep blue catching the light like a winking eye. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the cursed brooch from the sewing circle meeting. Could this bead be part of it? She recalled Mrs. Price's insistence that the brooch had been locked away, yet its tarnished state suggested it had been handled. Perhaps here, in this forgotten place. Her gaze swept the room, landing on a tattered ledger tucked behind a crate. Its pages were yellowed, but the ink was fresh in places, listing dates and cryptic entries. SB delivered, 3rd Oct, RT to collect, 7th Oct. The initials nagged at her. SB could be the sapphire brooch, and RT might stand for Reginald Thorne. But what were they collecting, and why here? The mill, she realized, wasn't abandoned. It was a hiding place, a meeting point for secrets too heavy for the vicarage parlour. As she slipped the ledger into her bag, a noise, a soft shuffle, came from outside. Miss Marple froze, her heart steady, but her senses sharp. Through a crack in the wall, she glimpsed a figure moving past, too quick to identify, but the flash of a red scarf was unmistakable. Lucy Hale had worn one just like it at the sewing circle. Was she following the same trail, or leaving her own? Miss Marple waited, silent, until the footsteps faded, then made her way back to the village, the sack and ledger weighing heavily in her hands. The mill had given her clues, but also questions. Why was Lucy here? What tied the sewing circle's tools to this desolate place? And how deep did Reginald Thorne's role run? Back in her cottage, Miss Marple spread the sack's contents on her table, the candle stub and scissors glinting under her lamp. She thought of a case from years ago, where a hidden stash in a barn revealed a smuggling ring. This felt similar, but the stakes were personal, tied to the women she saw each week. The sapphire bead, the ledger's cryptic notes, Lucy's red scarf. They were pieces of a puzzle, and the shadow over the sewing circle was growing darker. As she sipped her tea, her needles resumed their rhythm, each click a step closer to the truth. The mill's secrets were only the beginning, and the village's quiet facade was starting to crack, hinting at revelations yet to come. Chapter 4. Echoes from the Past. The afternoon light slanted through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, casting intricate patterns on the polished wooden floor that resembled the tangled web of clues she was unravelling. With the items from the mill laid out before her, the canvas sack, the sapphire bead, and the cryptic ledger, Miss Marple felt the weight of history pressing in. St. Mary Mead might seem timeless, but its roots ran deep into old feuds and forgotten fortunes, and she suspected the shadow over the sewing circle stemmed from something long buried. Sipping her chamomile tea, she decided to delve into the village archives at the local library, a modest building tucked behind the church, where dusty tomes held the whispers of generations past. The library was quiet, save for the soft rustle of pages turned by the occasional visitor. Mr. Harold Jenkins, the librarian, a bespectacled man with a perpetual hunch from years bent over books, greeted her with a nod. "Miss Marple, always a pleasure. Looking for something specific today?" His voice echoed slightly in the high-ceilinged room, lined with oak shelves groaning under the weight of history. Miss Marple smiled warmly, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "The Price family history, if you please, Mr. Jenkins, and perhaps anything on the old mill, its owners, its uses over the years." Jenkins raised an eyebrow but led her to a back corner, pulling out a leather-bound volume titled Chronicles of St. Mary Mead, Families and Fortunes. As he left her to it, Miss Marple settled at a scarred oak table, the ledger from the mill open beside her for reference. The chronicles painted a vivid picture of the Price lineage, tracing back to the 18th century when Elias Price, a prosperous merchant, built his fortune on imported silks and jewels. The sapphire brooch, it seemed, was no ordinary heirloom. It had been a gift from a Raja in India, bestowed upon Elias during a trading voyage, and rumoured to carry a curse of misfortune for those who possessed it unworthily. Miss Marple's fingers traced the faded ink. Tales of lost ships, untimely deaths, and a family rift in the 1920s when two brothers quarrelled over the brooch, one accusing the other of theft. The accused brother, Theodore Price, vanished shortly after, leaving behind whispers of foul play. Could this be connected? She cross-referenced the ledger's dates. The SB entries aligned with anniversaries of Theodore's disappearance. Her mind wandered to Mrs. Eleanor Price, the current guardian of the brooch. Eleanor was Theodore's granddaughter, she recalled from village lore. Turning to the mill's history, another volume revealed it had once been a bustling textile factory owned by the Prices, processing those very imported silks. Abandoned after a fire in the 1940s, suspiciously set, some claimed, it had fallen into disrepair, but rumours persisted of hidden compartments built during wartime for smuggling goods. Miss Marple leaned back, piecing it together. The mill as a secret vault, the brooch as a key to old grievances. The sapphire beads she'd found matched descriptions in the chronicles. Part of a set dismantled during the family feud. Someone was reassembling it, perhaps, or using it as leverage. But who? Reginald Thorne's name nagged at her. His initials in the ledger suggested involvement, but what was his stake? As she pondered, a shadow fell across the table. Looking up, She saw Widow Agnes Blackwood standing there, her face drawn and her hands clutching a worn book of poetry. "Miss Marple," Agnes said, her voice a hushed tremor. "I didn't expect to see you here." Miss Marple invited her to sit, noting the widow's uneasy glance around the room. Agnes had been part of the sewing circle for years, her dramatic stories often laced with hints of her own turbulent past. Her late husband, a sailor, had ties to the Prices through trade routes. "Researching the old days?" Agnes asked, her eyes flicking to the open chronicles. Miss Marple nodded gently. "The brooch has quite a history." "Do you know much about it?" Agnes hesitated, then leaned in. "My Albert used to speak of it. Said Theodore Price didn't vanish. He was driven away by his brother over that cursed thing. There were letters, hidden away, proving theft. But they disappeared with him." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "Letters, another piece. And the mill?" She probed softly. Agnes's face paled. "Albert went there once before he died. Found a loose floorboard with old papers, but he left them be. Said it was family business." The widow stood abruptly, as if regretting her words. "I shouldn't say more. But be careful, Miss Marple. Shadows from the past can swallow the present." With that, she hurried away, leaving Miss Marple with a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty library. Gathering her notes, Miss Marple left the library as evening approached, the sky bruising with twilight hues. The village streets were emptying, lanterns flickering to life in windows like watchful eyes. She replayed Agnes's words. Hidden letters, a loose floorboard. It tied back to the mill where she'd seen the dragged crate, and Lucy's red scarf. Young Lucy Hale, new to the village but eager to fit in. What was her connection? Miss Marple recalled Lucy mentioning a fascination with antiques during the sewing circle. Perhaps she was Thorne's accomplice, or unwittingly drawn in. Arriving home, Miss Marple added her library findings to the growing collection on her table. The chronicles' tales of curses and feuds, Agnes's revelations about letters. These were no coincidences. The sewing circle, with its innocent facade of needles and threads, masked a revival of old sins. Mrs. Price's invitation to Thorne now seemed calculated, perhaps to expose or conceal. Clara's fear, Lucy's presence at the mill, Agnes's knowledge, they all intertwined like knotted yarn. As night fell, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting a steady rhythm against the quiet. The shadow was lengthening, reaching from history into the heart of St. Mary Mead. She sensed a confrontation brewing, one that would pull the threads tight and reveal the pattern beneath. With echoes of the past resonating louder, the mystery beckoned toward unexpected alliances and deeper deceptions. Chapter 5. The Unravelling Thread. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, wrapping the village in a gauzy veil that blurred the edges of houses and hedgerows. Miss Marple, fortified by a strong cup of tea and her growing suspicions, decided to pay a visit to Mrs. Eleanor Price. The sapphire brooch, the mill's secrets, and Agnes's cryptic warning about hidden letters pointed to Eleanor as the linchpin of the mystery. If anyone knew why old family wounds were resurfacing, it was the matriarch of the sewing circle. With her knitting bag slung over her shoulder, Miss Marple set out for the Price estate, a grand but weathered manor at the edge of the village, its ivy-clad walls hiding as much as they revealed. The manor's oak door creaked open to reveal Eleanor, impeccably dressed in a high-necked blouse, her silver hair pinned tightly as if to keep her composure in place. "Miss Marple, what a surprise," she said, her smile polite but guarded, her eyes flicking to the knitting bag as if it might conceal a weapon. Miss Marple returned the smile, stepping into the parlour where portraits of stern-faced Price ancestors glowered from the walls. The air smelled of wax polish and old roses, and a fire crackled in the hearth, casting restless shadows. "I thought we might chat about the sewing circle," Miss Marple began, settling into a velvet chair. "And that curious brooch of yours." Eleanor's hand twitched, but she gestured for tea, her movements deliberate, as the maid poured steaming Darjeeling. Miss Marple steered the conversation carefully, like threading a needle through delicate silk. The brooch's appearance at the meeting was quite the event, she said lightly. It must hold great meaning for your family. Eleanor's cup paused mid-air. It's an heirloom, nothing more, she replied, her voice clipped. Sentimental value, but hardly worth the fuss. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes gentle but probing. Yet Mr. Thorne seemed fascinated, and I hear he's been asking about your family's past, around the mill no less. Eleanor's face tightened, a fleeting crack in her composure. Reginald is a professional. He appraises antiques, not gossip. Sensing resistance, Miss Marple shifted tactics, mentioning the village's recent unease, the strange lights, the whispers of theft. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her saucer. People talk too much, she said sharply. The mill's just an old ruin, and the brooch was misplaced. That's all. But Miss Marple caught the lie in her tone, the same strained note she'd heard in a case years ago when a woman hid her brother's debts behind a facade of pride. Pressing gently, she asked, Did Theodore Price ever mention letters about the brooch? Something that might explain its sudden return? Eleanor stood abruptly, nearly upsetting the tea tray. Theodore's name is not to be dragged through the mud, she snapped. He left this village, and that's the end of it. The outburst confirmed Miss Marple's hunch. Eleanor was protecting more than a jewel. Excusing herself, Miss Marple wandered toward the manor's hallway, ostensibly to admire a tapestry, but really to observe. A locked glass cabinet caught her eye, displaying family relics. Silver spoons, a gold locket, and an empty velvet cushion where the brooch might have rested. Beside it, a photograph showed a young Eleanor with a man resembling Theodore, their faces strained despite the festive setting. A letter, half visible under a book on a nearby table, bore the same handwriting as the mill's ledger. Miss Marple didn't touch it, but her mind catalogued the detail. Eleanor was hiding documents, perhaps the very letters Agnes mentioned. As she left the manor, the sky darkened with gathering clouds, mirroring the storm brewing in her thoughts. Eleanor's defensiveness, the photograph, the letter, they pointed to a family secret tied to Theodore's disappearance. Miss Marple recalled the ledger's entries. RT to collect. Was Thorne working for Eleanor or against her? And where did Clara and Lucy fit in? Clara's fear suggested she knew something, while Lucy's red scarf at the mill hinted at involvement. Walking home, Miss Marple passed the vicarage, where she spotted Clara Finch hurrying out, her face pale and her hands clutching a small parcel. Their eyes met briefly, and Clara's widened in panic before she scurried away. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple added the day's observations to her mental tapestry. Eleanor's reaction confirmed the brooch was a key, not just to wealth but to shame. The letters, if they existed, might reveal who stood to gain or lose by its return. Clara's behaviour suggested she was either a victim or a conspirator, and Lucy's presence at the mill hinted at a younger generation entangled in old sins. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their steady rhythm, each stitch a step closer to clarity. The sewing circle was no mere hobby. It was a cover for motives as sharp as the needles they wielded. As rain began to patter against her windows, Miss Marple sensed the mystery tightening, pulling her toward a truth that might unravel more than just the sewing circle's secrets. Chapter 6. The candles flicker. The rain had turned St. Mary Mead into a glistening mosaic of puddles and wet cobblestones, the kind of weather that kept villagers indoors and secrets tightly guarded. Miss Marple, undeterred by the drizzle, pulled her shawl tighter and set out for Clara Finch's modest cottage on the village's quieter side. Clara's panicked expression outside the vicarage lingered in Miss Marple's mind, as did the parcel she'd clutched so tightly. The timid seamstress, with her trembling hands and averted eyes, was a loose thread in the mystery, and Miss Marple sensed that tugging gently might unravel something significant. The sapphire bead, the mill's ledger, and Eleanor's defensiveness all pointed to a web of connections, and Clara seemed caught in its strands. Clara's cottage was small, its garden overrun with wildflowers that bowed under the rain. A faint glow flickered through the window, suggesting a candle rather than a lamp. A curious choice for mid-afternoon. Miss Marple knocked softly, her umbrella dripping onto the stone step. After a long pause, Clara opened the door, her face as pale as the linen she sewed. "Miss Marple," she stammered, her eyes darting past as if expecting someone else. I wasn't expecting visitors." Miss Marple offered a reassuring smile, stepping inside before Clara could protest. The parlour was cramped but tidy, with stacks of fabric and half-finished scarves draped over every surface. A single candle burned on the table, its flame wavering as if nervous itself. "I thought we might chat about the sewing circle," Miss Marple said, settling into a worn chair. "You seemed unsettled at the last meeting." Clara's hands twisted a scrap of cloth, her knuckles white. "It's nothing," she murmured, but her voice betrayed her. Miss Marple's gaze softened, her tone gentle as she mentioned the brooch's sudden appearance. Clara flinched, her eyes flicking to the candle. "I don't know anything about it," she said too quickly. Miss Marple nodded, letting the silence stretch, a tactic she'd used before to coax out truths. She noticed a small wooden box on a shelf, its lid slightly askew, revealing a glint of metal, a thimble perhaps, or something more telling, changing tack. Miss Marple mentioned the mill, watching Clara closely. "I hear strange things happen there. Lights at night, odd visitors." Clara's breath caught, and the candle flickered as if mirroring her unease. "I don't go there," she whispered, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of guilt. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice kind but firm. "Clara, dear, if you're in trouble, you can tell me. Secrets have a way of growing heavier." Clara's resolve cracked, tears welling. "It's not my secret," she choked out. "I found something, papers, in the vicarage, tucked in an old hymn book. They mentioned the brooch and Theodore Price. I hid them at the mill, but someone saw me." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Papers, likely the letters Agnes had hinted at, tying back to Theodore's disappearance. "Who saw you?" she asked gently. Clara shook her head, fear silencing her. "I can't say. They'll know I told." Before Miss Marple could press further, a sharp knock at the door startled them both. Clara froze, her eyes wide. "Don't answer it," she whispered. But Miss Marple, ever calm, rose and peered through the window. Outside stood Lucy Hale, her red scarf vivid against the grey rain, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple opened the door, greeting Lucy with a smile that masked her suspicions. "Lucy, what brings you out in this weather?" Lucy's smile was tight, her hands buried in her coat pockets. "Just checking on Clara. She seemed upset after the meeting." Clara's face drained of colour, and Miss Marple noted the tension between them, Lucy's bold confidence clashing with Clara's shrinking fear. "How kind," Miss Marple said, ushering Lucy in. The parlour felt smaller with the three of them, the candle's light casting long shadows that seemed to dance with secrets. Lucy's eyes swept the room, lingering on the wooden box. "Working on something new, Clara?" she asked, her tone casual but probing. The conversation stayed light, but Miss Marple sensed undercurrents. Lucy mentioned her interest in antiques, praising Thorne's expertise, while Clara barely spoke, her fingers shredding the cloth in her lap. When Lucy left, citing a need to catch the post, Miss Marple lingered. "Clara, those papers, where exactly did you hide them?" Clara hesitated, then whispered. "Under a floorboard near the mill's crates. But please don't go looking. It's dangerous." Miss Marple patted her hand, promising nothing but storing the detail away. As she walked home through the rain, Miss Marple's mind wove the new clues. Clara's papers, hidden at the mill, likely held the truth about Theodore and the brooch. Lucy's unexpected visit felt less like concern and more like surveillance. Was she working with Thorn, or driven by her own motives? The candle in Clara's cottage echoed the stub from the mill, suggesting late-night visits to conceal or retrieve something. Miss Marple recalled a case where a nervous villager's habits, burning candles to hide nighttime errands, revealed a theft. Clara was no thief, but she was scared, caught in a plot she didn't fully understand. At her cottage, Miss Marple lit her own lamp, the rain tapping a steady rhythm against the windows. The mystery was tightening, each clue a stitch pulling the pattern into focus. Clara's fear, Lucy's presence, the hidden papers, they were all linked to the shadow cast by the brooch and the mill. As she picked up her knitting, Miss Marple knew her next step. Return to the mill and find those papers before someone else did. The rain showed no sign of stopping, and the secrets of St. Mary Mead were rising to the surface, ready to be exposed. Chapter 7. Beneath the floorboards, the rain had eased to a fine mist by evening, cloaking St. Mary Mead in a hush that seemed to amplify every creak and whisper. Miss Marple, never one to shy from a challenge, prepared for a return to the old mill. Clara's admission about hidden papers under a floorboard had lit a spark in her mind, and she knew time was slipping away. Someone else, perhaps Lucy or Thorn, might already be closing in. With her sturdy boots laced and her umbrella doubling as a tool for prying, she slipped out into the twilight, her knitting bag concealing a small torch. The village lay quiet, its windows glowing like beacons, but the mill loomed ahead, a dark sentinel guarding its secrets. The path to the mill was slick with mud, and Miss Marple moved carefully, her torch casting a narrow beam that danced across the wet grass. The footprints she'd seen before were blurred now, but fresh marks caught her eye. Deep, hurried impressions leading to the mill's door. Her pulse quickened. Someone had been here since her last visit. She paused, listening. The night was still, save for the distant hoot of an owl and the drip of water from the mill's sagging eaves. Satisfied she was alone, she eased the door open, its hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was heavy with damp and decay, the faint, musty smell mingling with something sharper, oil, perhaps, or metal. Miss Marple's torch swept the room, illuminating the crates she'd seen before. The sapphire bead she'd found last time still weighed on her mind, a clue tying the mill to the Price family's cursed heirloom. She moved to the corner Clara had described, near the crates, where the floorboards sagged underfoot. Kneeling, she ran her fingers along the wood, feeling for a loose edge. One board shifted slightly, its nails rusted and yielding. With her umbrella's tip, she pried it up, revealing a shallow hollow beneath. There, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small bundle of papers, yellowed but intact, tied with a frayed ribbon. Her hand steady, she tucked the bundle into her bag, but not before noticing a faint metallic glint deeper in the hollow. A second sapphire bead, identical to the first. As she replaced the floorboard, a soft thud echoed from the mill's far end near the broken machinery. Miss Marple froze, her torch extinguished to avoid detection. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approached, accompanied by the faint rustle of fabric. She pressed herself against a crate, her breath shallow. A figure emerged into a sliver of moonlight filtering through a cracked window. Reginald Thorn, his waxed moustache unmistakable, his eyes scanning the room. In his hand was a small crowbar, its tip gleaming as if freshly used. He moved toward the crates, muttering under his breath. "It has to be here." Miss Marple's mind raced. Thorn was searching for the papers, or perhaps something else hidden in the mill. She waited, silent as he pried open a crate, its wood splintering softly. Inside she glimpsed more glints, metal, possibly jewellery or tools like those in Clara's cottage. Thorn's face twisted in frustration, and he turned toward the floorboards she'd just searched. Before he could reach them, a second sound, a sharp gasp, came from the doorway. Miss Marple peered around the crate and saw Lucy Hale, her red scarf loosened, her expression a mix of fear and defiance. "Reginald, stop!" Lucy hissed, her voice low but urgent. "You're going too far." Thorne spun, his crowbar raised. "You shouldn't be here, Lucy. This doesn't concern you." Their voices dropped to whispers, but Miss Marple caught fragments, references to the letters, the deal, and Eleanor's mistake. The confrontation ended abruptly when a distant dog barked, startling them both. Thorne shoved the crowbar into his coat and strode out, Lucy following after a hesitant glance around. Miss Marple waited until their footsteps faded, then slipped from her hiding place. Her heart pounded, not from fear but from the thrill of discovery. The papers in her bag felt heavier now, their contents likely the key to Theodore Price's fate and the brooch's curse. Lucy's involvement with Thorne was no surprise, but her tone suggested conflict. Perhaps she was an unwilling accomplice, or playing her own game. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple spread the papers on her table, her lamp casting a warm glow over the faded ink. The letters were from Theodore Price, dated 1923, addressed to his brother, accusing him of stealing the brooch to fund a failing venture. One letter mentioned a hiding place in the mill, where Theodore had stashed proof of his ownership, a deed to a forgotten family vault. Another spoke of a betrayal, hinting at a third party who knew too much. The handwriting matched the ledgers, confirming Thorne's connection, but the second sapphire bead suggested more pieces of the brooch were scattered, perhaps deliberately. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting needles idle for once. Lucy's presence at the mill, Thorne's search, and the letters pointed to a scheme to reclaim or exploit the Price family's lost wealth, but Clara's role remained unclear. Was she a bystander, or had she stumbled into danger? The mill was a nexus, drawing the sewing circle's threads together, and Miss Marple knew she'd need to confront one of them soon. Perhaps Lucy, whose red scarf kept weaving through the mystery. As the village clock chimed midnight, Miss Marple felt the shadow over St. Mary Mead growing sharper, its edges cutting closer to the truth. Chapter 8. Shadows Converge. The first light of dawn filtered through the mist-shrouded windows of Miss Marple's cottage, casting a soft, ethereal glow over the table strewn with the letters from the mill. Miss Marple, having spent a restless night poring over the faded documents, now sipped her morning tea with a contemplative air, her mind a whirlwind of connections and conjectures. The letters painted a vivid portrait of betrayal within the Price family. Theodore's accusations against his brother for stealing the sapphire brooch to settle gambling debts, references to a secret vault in the mill where evidence was stashed, and hints of a third party. A shadowy figure who had facilitated the theft for a share of the profits. The handwriting, elegant yet hurried, matched samples Miss Marple had seen in the village chronicles, confirming their authenticity. But the real revelation was a postscript in one letter. "The beads are the key. Scatter them, and the curse scatters with them." This explained the loose sapphires she'd found. Someone was piecing the brooch back together, perhaps to unlock that vault or lift the supposed curse. Her thoughts turned to Lucy Hale, the young woman from London whose red scarf had become a recurring motif in the mystery. Lucy's confrontation with Thorne at the mill suggested she was entangled, but her plea, "You're going too far," hinted at reluctance or a change of heart. Miss Marple decided a direct approach was warranted. Subtlety had its place, but the threads were tightening, and delay might allow the shadow to deepen irreversibly. After a light breakfast of toast and marmalade, she donned her coat and set out for Lucy's rented bungalow on the village outskirts, a modern contrast to St. Mary Mead's thatched roofs, with its clean lines and potted geraniums adding a touch of urban flair. The bungalow's door was answered promptly by Lucy, her youthful face framed by tousled auburn hair, her eyes showing faint shadows of fatigue. She wore a simple blouse and skirt, but the red scarf was draped over a chair inside, as if recently discarded. "Miss Marple," Lucy said, her surprise evident but quickly masked with a smile. "To what do I owe this visit?" Miss Marple returned the smile, stepping into the bright sitting room filled with books on antiques and modern art, a stark departure from the village's traditional decor. "Just a neighbourly call, dear. I've been thinking about the sewing circle and wondered if you might share your thoughts on our recent gathering." Lucy gestured to a seat, pouring tea from a pot that steamed invitingly, though her hands betrayed a slight tremor. As they settled, Miss Marple steered the conversation gently, beginning with innocuous topics like London fashions and the challenges of village life. Lucy responded animatedly at first, her voice carrying the clipped accents of the city. But when Miss Marple mentioned the mill, a subtle shift occurred. Lucy's cup clinked against its saucer, her gaze averting to the window. "The mill? Why bring that up?" she asked, her tone casual but laced with caution. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Oh, just curiosity. I've heard tales of its history with the Price family, and I couldn't help noticing your scarf there. It reminds me of one I saw near the mill recently." Lucy's cheeks flushed, her fingers toying with a pendant around her neck, a small antique locket that glinted in the light. Sensing the moment, Miss Marple pressed on, her voice soft yet insistent. "Lucy, my dear, I know you were at the mill last night, and I overheard your exchange with Mr. Thorne. This isn't mere gossip. It's a matter that could unravel into something quite serious." Lucy's composure cracked, her eyes welling with unshed tears. She set her cup down, her shoulders slumping. "I didn't want any part of it, Miss Marple. It started innocently enough. I met Reginald in London. He's an antique dealer, and I was studying art history. He told me about this lost treasure in St. Mary Mead, a family heirloom with a romantic curse. He said Eleanor Price had hired him to appraise it, but really, he wanted to find the scattered pieces for himself." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly, her mind filing away the details. Lucy continued, her words tumbling out like loosened stitches. "He convinced me to join the sewing circle to get close to Eleanor and the others. Clara found some old letters in the vicarage, hidden in a book, she said, and panicked, hiding them at the mill. Reginald wanted them. They proved the brooch was Theodore's, not his brother's, and point to a vault with more valuables. But when I saw how scared Clara was, and how ruthless Reginald could be, I tried to stop him last night. He's not just after antiques. He thinks there's a fortune in that vault, enough to settle his own debts." Lucy paused, wiping her eyes. "Eleanor knows some of it. She invited him to stir things up, hoping to flush out anyone who knew about Theodore. But she doesn't realize Reginald's playing her too." The revelations poured forth, painting a fuller picture. Thorne's debts from failed deals in London, his discovery of the Price legend through old auction records, and his recruitment of Lucy as an unwitting spy. The strange lights at the mill were Thorne's nocturnal searches, using a lantern to probe hidden compartments. Clara, in her timidity, had become a pawn, her candle purchases for those same late-night errands under duress. Agnes Blackwood's husband had once confided in her about the vault, which is why she'd hinted at it in the library. And the sewing circle? It was the perfect cover, a group where women shared more than patterns. Secrets slipped out over tea and threads. Miss Marple listened intently, her knitting bag untouched beside her, though her mind was busily weaving the new information into the tapestry. "And the sapphire beads?" she inquired gently. Lucy nodded. "Parts of the brooch, dismantled by Theodore to hide them. Reginald has collected most, but he needs the letters for the vault's combination, clues embedded in the text." Miss Marple's thoughts raced to the bundle in her possession. She had the key, quite literally, to unlocking the mystery. As the conversation wound down, Lucy's relief was palpable, her burden lightened by confession. "What should I do, Miss Marple? Reginald won't stop." Miss Marple patted her hand reassuringly. "Leave it to me, dear, but stay clear of the mill and Thorne for now." Leaving the bungalow, Miss Marple felt a surge of clarity. The shadow was no longer formless. It had names and motives. Thorne's greed, Eleanor's pride, Clara's fear, Lucy's regret, Agnes's knowledge. They all converged on the mill's vault, but a nagging question remained. Was there more to Theodore's disappearance? The letters suggested foul play, perhaps even murder, covered up by the family curse myth. Walking back through the village, now bustling with morning activity, the baker's cart rumbling by, children laughing on their way to school, Miss Marple pondered her next move. Confronting Thorn directly was risky. Better to gather the sewing circle, force the truths into the open. But first, she'd secure the letters and beads, perhaps enlisting the vicar's help for safekeeping. The rain had cleared, leaving the air crisp, but Miss Marple sensed a storm brewing, not of weather but of revelations. At her cottage, she locked the letters away, her knitting resuming as a meditative rhythm. The pieces were aligning, but one twist could change everything. As noon approached, a knock at her door startled her. It was Agnes Blackwood, her face ashen. "Miss Marple, come quick. Clara's gone missing, and there's a note at her cottage, from Thorn." The shadows were converging faster than anticipated, drawing Miss Marple deeper into the heart of the enigma. Chapter 9. The Note's Warning. The midday sun struggled through the clouds over St. Mary Mead, casting a pale light that did little to warm the chill in Miss Marple's heart as she hurried alongside Agnes Blackwood toward Clara Finch's cottage. Agnes's urgent words, "Clara missing, a note from Thorn," had set alarm bells ringing in her mind. The mystery, which had been a careful unravelling of threads, now felt like a race against time. The village bustled with its usual rhythm, Mrs. Miller sweeping her shop's doorstep, the postman whistling as he cycled past. But to Miss Marple, each familiar sight seemed tinged with menace, as if the shadow over the sewing circle had crept into the very streets. Clara's cottage looked unchanged from the outside, its wildflower garden still drooping from yesterday's rain. But the door stood slightly ajar, a detail that made Miss Marple's pulse quicken. Agnes, her face etched with worry, clutched her shawl tightly. "I came to check on her after breakfast," she explained, her voice trembling. "She didn't answer, and when I looked inside, I found this on her table." She handed Miss Marple a folded piece of paper, its edges creased as if handled in haste. The note, written in a sharp, angular script, read, "Miss Finch, you've meddled too far. Keep silent, or the mill will claim more than secrets. R.T." The initials confirmed Reginald Thorn's involvement, and the threat sent a shiver through Miss Marple, not of fear, but of resolve. She recalled a case from her early days in the village, where a threatening letter had been a desperate ploy to silence a witness. Was Clara a witness or something more? Stepping into the cottage, Miss Marple scanned the parlour. The single candle from her last visit was gone, replaced by a faint burn mark on the table. The wooden box on the shelf was open, empty now, its contents, perhaps that glinting thimble or another clue, taken. A chair was overturned, suggesting a struggle or hurried departure. "Did you see anything else, Agnes?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes sweeping the room for details. Agnes shook her head, her voice breaking. "Just the note. I thought Clara might have gone to the vicarage, but the vicar hasn't seen her since yesterday." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Clara's fear at their last meeting, her admission about hiding the letters at the mill. It all pointed to her being a target. Thorn, or someone working with him, must have learned she'd spoken to Miss Marple. Agnes hovered anxiously as Miss Marple examined the room further. A scrap of fabric caught her eye, snagged on a splinter by the doorframe. Fine blue thread, the kind Clara used for her scarves, but stained with a dark smudge that looked like oil. It reminded her of the metallic scent in the mill, perhaps from Thorn's crowbar or the crates he'd pried open. "We must check the mill again," Miss Marple said firmly. "If Clara's in danger, that's where she'll be, or where we'll find answers." Agnes paled but nodded, her loyalty to her friend outweighing her fear. Together they set out, Miss Marple's umbrella tapping the ground like a metronome, her knitting bag now heavier, with the weight of the hidden letters and sapphire beads. The mill loomed as ominously as ever, its silhouette stark against the grey sky. The door was locked this time, the padlock new and shiny, a stark contrast to the rusted one before. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Someone was taking precautions. She circled the building, Agnes trailing nervously, and found a broken window low enough to peer through. Inside, the crates remained, but a faint glow flickered from the far corner. A candle, its light unsteady. "Stay here," Miss Marple whispered to Agnes, who nodded, clutching her shawl. Using her umbrella to clear the jagged glass, Miss Marple climbed through with surprising agility for her age, her torch lighting the way. The mill's interior was colder now, the air thick with tension. The candle's glow came from behind a stack of crates, and as Miss Marple approached, she heard a muffled sob. There, bound with coarse rope and gagged with a scrap of cloth, was Clara, her eyes wide with terror. Miss Marple knelt beside her, whispering reassurances as she worked the knots loose. "You're safe now, dear," she murmured, though her senses stayed sharp for any sign of Thorn. Clara, freed, gasped out her story in fragments. Thorn had confronted her at dawn, demanding the letters. When she admitted hiding them, he'd forced her to the mill, threatening to expose her as a thief unless she cooperated. "He's after the vault," Clara whispered. "He thinks it's under the mill, and the letters have the combination." Miss Marple helped Clara to her feet, guiding her toward the window. But before they could escape, footsteps crunched outside, heavy and deliberate. Agnes's voice called softly, "Miss Marple, someone's coming." Peering out, Miss Marple saw a figure approaching. Not Thorn, but Eleanor Price, her face grim and her hands clutching a small, ornate key. The sight startled Miss Marple. Eleanor's involvement was deeper than she'd suspected. Was she here to confront Thorn, protect the vault, or silence Clara? Miss Marple ushered Clara behind a crate, whispering, "Stay quiet." She stepped back into the shadows, her mind racing to connect Eleanor's key to the vault's lock. As Eleanor entered, her eyes scanned the mill with a mix of determination and dread. "Clara?" she called, her voice sharp. "I know you're here. We need to end this." Miss Marple stepped forward, her presence startling Eleanor, who dropped the key with a clatter. "Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said calmly, "perhaps you can explain what brings you here." Eleanor's composure faltered, her hands trembling. "It's my family's legacy," she said, her voice low. "Theodore was wronged, and I thought Thorn could help restore our name. But he's betrayed me, and now Clara's caught in it." The pieces were falling into place. Eleanor's invitation to Thorn was a gambit to reclaim the brooch's honour, but his greed had twisted it into a hunt for the vault. Clara's sobs behind the crate confirmed her innocence, but Eleanor's key suggested she knew more than she'd let on. Before Miss Marple could press further, a shadow moved at the mill's entrance. Thorn, his crowbar gleaming, his face set in a dangerous scowl. "Well, well," he said, stepping inside. "The whole circle's here, it seems." The mill, once a silent witness, now held a standoff, with Miss Marple at its centre, ready to pull the final threads of truth into the light. Chapter 10. The final stitch. The old mill's air was thick with dust and tension, the flickering candle casting jagged shadows across the weathered beams as Miss Marple stood poised between Clara Finch. Trembling behind a crate, Eleanor Price, clutching her ornate key, and Reginald Thorn, his crowbar glinting with menace. St. Mary Mead's quiet charm seemed a world away, the mill now a crucible where secrets would either be forged into truth or buried forever. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, took in every detail. Clara's tear-streaked face, Eleanor's rigid posture, Thorn's predatory stance. Her knitting bag rested at her feet, but her mind was her sharpest tool, weaving the final threads of the mystery into a coherent pattern. "Let's put an end to this shadow," she said softly, her voice steady, cutting through the charged silence. Thorn smirked, his moustache twitching. You're meddling in things you don't understand, Miss Marple. Step aside, and no one gets hurt. But Miss Marple stood her ground, her calm demeanour belying the fire of conviction within. Oh, I understand quite well, Mr. Thorne. The sapphire brooch, the hidden vault, Theodore Price's letters. It's all about greed, isn't it? Her words struck like a needle, and Thorne's grip on the crowbar tightened. Eleanor gasped, her key slipping slightly in her hand while Clara stifled a sob. Agnes Blackwood, still outside, peered through the broken window. Her presence a quiet support Miss Marple acknowledged with a glance. "Let's start with the brooch," Miss Marple began, her tone conversational yet commanding. "It was never just an heirloom, was it, Mrs. Price? Your grandfather Theodore owned it rightfully, a gift from a Rajah, but his brother stole it, sparking a feud that drove Theodore from the village. The letters I found confirm he hid proof of his ownership, a deed to a family vault, in this very mill, along with the brooch's scattered sapphire beads to thwart the curse he believed plagued his family." Eleanor's face paled, but she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I wanted to restore his honour. The brooch was my birthright. But I couldn't find the deed without those letters." Miss Marple turned to Thorne, whose eyes darted to the crates as if calculating his next move. "You, Mr. Thorne, learned of the Price family's legend through auction records in London, a vault rumoured to hold jewels and gold, locked with a combination hidden in Theodore's letters. You came to St. Mary Mead under the guise of an antique dealer, but your debts drove you to seek the vault for yourself." Thorne's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. "Clever old lady, but you're too late. I have most of the beads, and I'll find those letters." "Not quite," Miss Marple said, reaching into her bag to produce the oilcloth bundle. "I have them, and they tell a darker story. Theodore didn't just vanish. He was betrayed, possibly murdered, by someone close to the family. The letters hint at a third party, someone who profited from the theft." She paused, her gaze shifting to Eleanor. "Mrs. Price, you invited Thorne to the sewing circle, hoping he'd authenticate the brooch and clear Theodore's name. But you didn't know he'd manipulate others to get to the vault first." Eleanor's shoulders sagged, her key now dangling uselessly. "I thought I could control him," she admitted. "I found one bead in our family's sewing box and suspected Theodore had hidden more. I wanted the truth out, but I didn't realize how far Thorne would go." Miss Marple nodded, turning to Clara, who stepped forward, her voice shaky but resolute. "Thorne forced me to help," Clara said. "I found the letters in the vicarage hymn book, left there years ago by Theodore's confidant. I hid them in the mill, but Thorne saw me. He threatened to accuse me of stealing unless I helped him search." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "You were frightened, Clara, but brave to hide the truth." She then faced Thorne, who was inching toward the crates. "And you, Mr. Thorne, enlisted Lucy Hale, thinking her youth and ambition would make her an easy ally. But she saw through your greed." Lucy, who had slipped into the mill unnoticed during the confrontation, spoke up, her red scarf a vivid splash against the gloom. "I wanted to help at first, thinking it was just about antiques. But when I saw you scare Clara and dig through the mill, I knew you'd hurt anyone for that vault." The final piece clicked into place. Miss Marple addressed the group, her voice clear. "The vault is real, hidden beneath the mill's floor, as Theodore's letters describe. The sapphire beads, when reunited, form the brooch's clasp, which fits the key Mrs. Price holds. A key to both the vault and the truth. But the curse isn't supernatural. It's the curse of greed and betrayal, passed down through the years." She pointed to the floor near the crates, where a faint outline suggested a trapdoor. "Shall we see what Theodore protected so fiercely?" Thorne lunged for the trapdoor, but Agnes, emboldened, stepped forward with surprising speed, blocking his path. "Enough, Reginald!" she snapped, her widow's strength shining through. Miss Marple, with Clara's help, lifted the trapdoor, revealing a small iron safe. Eleanor, tears streaming, handed over the key, and Miss Marple inserted it, turning it with a click. Inside were gold coins, a few small jewels, and a final letter from Theodore, confessing he'd planned to confront his betrayer, a family friend named Blackwood, Agnes's late husband's father. He was the third party, Miss Marple said softly to Agnes. Your husband knew, which is why he spoke of the mill's secrets. Agnes nodded, her face heavy with inherited guilt. Albert found papers, but kept silent to protect me. Thorne, seeing his plan unravel, made a desperate grab for the safe, but Lucy and Clara held him back, their combined strength surprising him. Miss Marple stepped in, her voice firm. The police will handle you, Mr. Thorne. The vault's contents belong to the Price family, and Theodore's name will be cleared. As the village constable arrived, summoned by a neighbour alerted by Agnes, Thorne was led away, his schemes undone. Eleanor, Clara and Lucy stood together, their differences softened by shared relief. The sewing circle, once a cover for secrets, would mend more than fabric now. It would mend trust. Miss Marple closed her bag, the letters and beads secure, her work done. The shadows lifted, she said, smiling at the women. St. Mary Mead can rest again. As she walked home, the village glowing under a clearing sky, Miss Marple felt the satisfaction of a puzzle solved. The brooch, reassembled, would be displayed in the vicarage, a symbol of truth over curse. If you've enjoyed this tale of mystery and intrigue, grab a cup of tea and join us for more by subscribing. Your support means the world to us. Comment below with your thoughts on Miss Marple's latest adventure.